Behind the massive rusticated stones of the Medici Palace in Florence, beneath ceilings painted with triumph and divinity, behind doors thick enough to silence a confession, an empire was engineered without a crown. Gold did not glitter here, it whispered. It moved in coded letters, sealed in wax, hidden in ledgers inked by candlelight. Within these walls, decisions were made that shifted the fate of kingdoms, crowned popes, financed wars, and quietly bent Europe toward the will of one family. The building still stands in Florence, heavy and immovable, its facade austere and unyielding. The lower stones are rough, almost brutal, as if the palace emerged from the earth itself. Higher up, the masonry smooths, refined and controlled, like ambition rising toward legitimacy. Every window is aligned with mathematical precision. Every corridor was designed not only for movement, but for surveillance. This was not merely a residence. It was a fortress disguised as a home, a bank disguised as a dynasty, a sanctuary that incubated power in silence. Inside, the air would have smelled of parchment, beeswax, damp stone, and iron from locked chests. In winter, the cold clung to the walls, despite roaring hearths. In summer, the thick masonry trapped the day's heat, pressing against the lungs of servants and clerks. Footsteps echoed across the inner courtyard, rising toward balconies that concealed watching eyes. Messages arrived by courier, boots muddy from distant roads, carrying news from Rome, London, Bruges, and Avignon. The fate of princes entered through the same doorway as sacks of Florentine florins. This was the hidden truth inside the Medici castle, a private residence that became the nerve center of Europe's most powerful financial network. Within these chambers, wealth was not displayed recklessly. It was structured, calculated, deployed. The family who lived here did not simply accumulate fortune. They weaponized credit, they mastered trust, they turned debt into obedience. And yet the walls absorbed more than triumph. They absorbed whispers of betrayal, arguments between brothers, the silent terror of financial collapse, the tension of political conspiracies. The palace watched as alliances formed and shattered. It listened as plans were drafted that would either secure immortality or invite annihilation. Every stone holds memory, every corridor carries weight, every shadow remembers. Part 1. The palace began as an idea in the mind of Cosimo de' Medici, known as Cosimo the Elder, a banker whose influence stretched far beyond Florence. When construction of the residence began in the 1440s, it was not conceived merely as a home for his family. It was conceived as a physical manifestation of control. The location was deliberate, positioned strategically in Florence, close enough to the political heart of the city to exert pressure, yet fortified enough to withstand unrest. Cosimo had already inherited a banking enterprise founded by his father, Giovanni de' Medici. But under Cosimo's direction, the Medici Bank expanded into a network that reached Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, London, and beyond. Papal accounts flowed through Medici hands. Monarchs depended on Medici credit. Wars were delayed or accelerated based on Medici liquidity, and yet all of it converged here. Inside the palace, the ground floor housed business operations. Ledgers lay open on heavy wooden tables. Ink stained the fingers of clerks who calculated interest with disciplined precision. Gold florins clinked in controlled rhythms, never loud enough to suggest excess. The Medici did not flaunt wealth recklessly, they institutionalized it. Above the business quarters were private apartments, decorated with restraint but undeniable refinement. Tapestries muted the echo of stone. Frescoes depicted sacred scenes, carefully aligning the family with divine favor. Religion and finance intertwined seamlessly within these walls. The Medici financed churches, monasteries, and artists. Piety and profit walked side by side across the same tiled floors. But the palace was not universally admired. Florence was a republic, wary of tyrants. Publicly, the Medici presented themselves as loyal citizens. Privately, within these rooms, strategy unfolded. Alliances with powerful families were negotiated. Rivals were studied. Influence over the signoria was cultivated through calculated generosity and discreet pressure. The palace became a silent parliament, its discussions shaping civic outcomes long before public votes were cast. Exile once threatened everything. In 1433, before the palace was completed, Cosimo was imprisoned by political rivals. The threat of execution hovered in the air of Florence like a storm. Yet gold moved quietly through unseen channels. Debts were called in, alliances activated. Within a year, Cosimo returned from exile stronger than before. The palace, once finished, would stand as a monument to that survival, a declaration that financial power could outlast political hostility. At night, candles flickered along corridors as correspondence from Rome was decoded. The Medici Bank handled papal revenues, indulgence funds, ecclesiastical taxes. Spiritual authority passed through financial filters. Decisions affecting the church were, in part, conditioned by the liquidity secured inside these walls. The atmosphere within the palace was disciplined, almost monastic. Silence was expected in working chambers. Conversations were measured. Even celebration was contained. Power here was not theatrical, it was procedural. Yet beneath the surface, calm tension persisted. Banking in the 15th century was a dangerous enterprise. Loans to monarchs carried immense risk. A default from a king could destroy an entire branch. Every ledger entry carried the potential for triumph or catastrophe. The palace absorbed the anxiety of these uncertainties. Each courier arriving from a distant court might carry confirmation of repayment or news of ruin. The weight of Europe pressed inward against these stone walls. The palace did not merely house a family, it housed a system that would redefine political influence. It stood as both sanctuary and battlefield, where conflicts were fought not with swords, but with signatures and seals. And as the Medici influence expanded, so did the shadows lengthening across their own household. Night settled heavily over Florence, and the palace transformed. By day, it projected disciplined authority. By night, it exhaled tension. The courtyard darkened first. Shadows pooled beneath the arches, swallowing the symmetry of Michelozzo's design. Oil lamps flickered in upper chambers, their glow faint against the thick stone that insulated the building from the city's murmurs. The gates closed with a resonant finality. Inside, the true pulse of the empire began. Clerks remained awake long after the city slept. The scratching of quills across parchment echoed faintly in vaulted rooms. Wax seals melted and hardened in cycles. Letters from Bruges detailed fluctuations in northern markets. Correspondence from London warned of instability in royal finances. Rome demanded liquidity for papal obligations. Every branch of the Medici Bank fed information back to this nucleus. Within a private chamber lined with shelves of ledgers, Cosimo de' Medici sat beneath painted ceilings depicting biblical triumphs. The irony was silent but present. Sacred imagery watched over calculations of interest and risk. The Medici did not treat finance as mere trade, it was governance. Numbers translated into leverage, leverage translated into obedience. The palace interior bore this tension physically. The floors were worn smooth by controlled pacing. Walls carried the faint scent of smoke embedded over decades. The air inside was thicker than outside, less forgiving. Decisions made here rarely remained confined to Florence. A loan extended to a monarch could fund a war. A withheld credit line could stall an army. The palace, in its stillness, shaped the movement of thousands beyond its gates. As Cosimo aged, the weight intensified. His son, Piero de' Medici, known later as Piero the Guti, inherited not only wealth but fragility. His health confined him to interior chambers, where heavy draperies softened the draught, yet trapped humidity. From cushioned seats near the window, he dictated instructions to agents abroad. The palace became quieter during his leadership, but the silence was strained. Rivals in Florence observed carefully, searching for weakness. Outside, Florence remained officially a republic. Inside, governance unfolded in subtler ways. The palace corridors connected to courtyards, chambers to hidden staircases. Movement within was controlled, servants were vetted, conversations were deliberate, trust was rationed. By the late 1460s, the next generation entered the stone labyrinth. Lorenzo de' Medici, later called Lorenzo the Magnificent. Under his presence, the atmosphere shifted. The palace became not only a financial command center, but a cultural engine. Poets, philosophers, and artists crossed its threshold. Discussions of Plato echoed in rooms that also stored international contracts. Yet beneath intellectual vibrancy, financial strain quietly accumulated. The Medici Bank was overextended. Branch managers in distant cities engaged in risky practices. Loans to powerful rulers carried political benefits but unstable returns. Within the palace, discrepancies in ledgers surfaced. Candlelight revealed columns that did not align as cleanly as before. Anxiety moved through corridors like a draft that could not be sealed. The environment amplified psychological pressure. Stone walls that once symbolized permanence began to feel confining. Every knock at the gate could signify news from abroad. Every courier's expression was scrutinized before he spoke. The palace, immovable and proud, now absorbed unease. And then, in 1478, violence approached the threshold. On April 26th of that year, during High Mass at the Cathedral of Florence, members of the Pazzi family conspired to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano. The conspiracy did not originate inside the palace walls, but its consequences converged there with devastating force. Giuliano was murdered inside the cathedral. Lorenzo escaped, wounded. When Lorenzo returned to the palace after the attack, blood still drying beneath bandages, the atmosphere within these rooms shifted permanently. The courtyard, once a space of measured commerce, became a fortress. Guards doubled, doors reinforced. The palace was no longer merely a financial hub, it was a target. Inside, grief and calculation coexisted. Giuliano's absence was physical, undeniable. His chambers remained, but he did not. Lorenzo, recovering within thick stone walls, planned retaliation. Political reprisals unfolded rapidly, executions followed, alliances were restructured. The palace served as command center for a purge that reshaped Florence. The stone absorbed the shock. The smell of iron lingered, not from coin, but from memory. The Medici had survived exile. They had survived financial volatility. Now they had survived assassination. But survival came at a cost. The psychological atmosphere within the palace hardened. Trust diminished further. The bank continued operating, but cracks had begun to widen. The palace remained standing, silent, imposing, but its walls had witnessed bloodshed tied directly to its influence. Power had drawn violence to its door, and the shadows within grew longer. The palace did not recover from the Pazzi conspiracy. It adapted. After 1478, the atmosphere inside the Medici residence changed in ways that could not be seen from the street. The facade remained immovable, its rusticated stone still projecting disciplined strength. But within, a new vigilance took root. Guards were positioned with greater care. Private chambers became more restricted. Meetings shifted deeper into interior rooms, away from balconies and external corridors. Lorenzo de' Medici now moved through the palace with a measured intensity. The wound he carried from the cathedral had healed, but something less visible remained altered. His authority was no longer merely financial or political, it was hardened by survival. The palace became an extension of his resolve. Inside the Chapel of the Magi, frescoed by Benozzo Gozzoli, the walls shimmered with procession scenes, vivid colors depicting the journey of kings. Members of the Medici family were embedded subtly within the sacred narrative. The imagery was deliberate. The palace did not simply house wealth, it curated legitimacy. Visitors walking through those painted chambers absorbed a message without a word being spoken. This family stood aligned with divine order. But behind the frescoes, behind the ceremonial halls, financial strain intensified. The Medici Bank, once the most stable financial institution in Europe, was deteriorating. Branches in Bruges and London faltered, mismanagement, corruption among distant partners, and excessive loans to rulers whose promises outpaced their resources created silent fractures. Reports arrived at the palace with increasing frequency. Numbers that once reassured now provoked unease. The rooms where ledgers were examined became quieter. Candles burned longer into the night. Clerks recalculated entries with tightened jaws. Ink-stained fingers hesitated before recording losses. The smell of parchment and wax mingled with something more intangible, apprehension. Lorenzo prioritized political stability in Florence, even as the bank weakened. His influence extended into cultural patronage. Artists, architects, and scholars passed through the palace gates regularly. Michelangelo, still young, would spend time within Medici circles. Philosophers debated Neoplatonism under painted ceilings. The palace pulsed with intellectual brilliance. Yet beneath this brilliance lay instability. The bank's capital was entangled with papal finances. When papal politics shifted, so did Medici liquidity. Rome was both ally and threat. Every papal election had consequences that echoed within these walls. The palace absorbed the anxiety of ecclesiastical negotiations. Letters sealed with the insignia of the Vatican were opened carefully, their contents determining future strategy. Florence itself was volatile. Republican factions simmered beneath surface calm. The Medici ruled indirectly, never claiming titles of monarchy, yet wielding undeniable control. That ambiguity created constant tension. The palace was simultaneously a private residence and the unofficial seat of power. Its corridors carried secrets that could destabilize the Republic if exposed. As Lorenzo aged, exhaustion became visible. He bore not only grief for his brother, but the cumulative strain of maintaining dominance. Within his private chamber, heavy drapes filtered light into a muted amber. Physicians visited. Conversations grew quieter. The palace, once vibrant with youthful ambition, felt increasingly weighted by fragility. In 1492, Lorenzo died inside these walls. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The palace seemed to contract. Servants moved more slowly. The courtyard echoed differently, as if absorbing absence. His son, Piero di Lorenzo de' Medici, later called Piero the Unfortunate, assumed control. He lacked his father's restraint and political precision. Outside Florence, France advanced under King Charles VIII. Italy became a corridor for foreign armies. Negotiations were required. Strength and diplomacy were essential. Within the palace, urgent discussions unfolded as French forces approached the region. Piero's decisions, made within these chambers, would destabilize everything. Faced with French pressure, he conceded fortresses and strategic positions without securing adequate guarantees. The perception of weakness spread rapidly through Florence. Inside the palace, tension became suffocating. Messengers arrived breathless. The city's mood shifted from cautious acceptance to open anger. The palace, once a symbol of controlled power, now stood exposed. In 1494, Florentines revolted. Crowds gathered. The heavy wooden doors that had closed so confidently each night now faced public fury. The Medici family fled the palace under threat, abandoning the residence that had anchored their dominance for decades. The rooms were left behind. Ledgers remained, chambers still carried the scent of extinguished candles. The palace endured, but without its masters. For the first time, the nerve center of Europe's most powerful banking dynasty stood emptied of authority. The silence inside was no longer strategic. It was forced. The building remained intact, its stones unchanged. Yet psychologically it had transformed, from fortress to relic in a matter of days. Power had withdrawn, and the walls, which had absorbed triumph and blood, now held abandonment. The palace did not fall when the Medici fled in 1494. It remained standing, silent and intact, its massive stones indifferent to the panic that had forced its masters into exile. But the atmosphere inside transformed into something colder than absence. It became hollow. The courtyard, once alive with controlled movement, bankers, diplomats, artists, servants, now echoed with unfamiliar footsteps. Officials of the Florentine Republic entered rooms that had previously been restricted. Doors were opened without permission. Chests were inspected. Papers were handled by hands that did not belong to the family that built the empire. The air inside felt disturbed, as though the walls resisted intrusion. Dust settled differently in unused chambers. Curtains remained drawn, muting daylight. The smell of extinguished hearths lingered. The palace, built as a command center, had become an occupied space. Florence itself entered a period of moral and political upheaval under the influence of Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar whose sermons reverberated through the city like thunder contained within stone. Though his fiery denunciations were delivered in churches, their psychological impact reached directly into the Medici palace. The residence had symbolized wealth, patronage, calculated influence. Savonarola condemned excess, corruption, vanity. His message redefined public perception. The bonfire of the vanities in 1497 sent smoke into the Florentine sky. Objects associated with luxury, art, books, ornaments were burned in public squares. Though the palace itself was not consumed by flames, its identity was symbolically scorched. The intellectual brilliance and patronage once celebrated within its walls now existed under suspicion. Inside, rooms that had hosted philosophical debate fell silent. The chapel frescoes remained vivid, but their meaning shifted. The palace, once perceived as aligned with divine favor, was now linked in the public imagination to moral decay. The transformation was not architectural, it was psychological. Meanwhile, the Medici Bank collapsed. Without centralized leadership and political stability, its branches deteriorated rapidly. Loans went unpaid. Foreign rulers prioritized survival over repayment. The intricate web of credit that had once bound Europe together unraveled. Inside the abandoned palace, the ledgers became relics of a vanished system. The building itself endured another transfer of ownership in 1512, when the Medici returned to Florence with the backing of Spanish forces and papal influence. The re-entry into the palace was not triumphant in the way Cosimo's return from exile had been decades earlier. It carried a harder edge, reinforced by external military power. When members of the family crossed the threshold again, the atmosphere inside was not the same. The walls still stood, but the innocence of early ambition was gone. The palace had witnessed exile, humiliation, ideological condemnation, and financial collapse. It had become a survivor. Within its chambers, new strategies were formed. Giovanni de' Medici, who would become Pope Leo X, carried with him the weight of ecclesiastical authority. His ascent to the papacy in 1513 shifted the center of gravity once more toward Rome. Yet Florence remained psychologically tethered to this palace. The building now symbolized something darker, resilience through compromise. The Medici were no longer merely bankers. They had transformed into a dynastic force entangled with papal power and European geopolitics. The palace reflected this evolution. Renovations subtly altered interior spaces. Art remained, but the financial operations that once defined the ground floor never fully regained their former intensity. The bank that had ruled Europe existed now more as memory than machine. Still, tension did not dissipate. Florence resisted permanent subjugation. Republican ideals resurfaced periodically. The palace stood as both residence and reminder, a physical embodiment of concentrated authority within a city that had long feared tyranny. In 1527, amid the broader chaos of the sack of Rome and renewed Florentine revolt, the Medici were expelled again. The palace experienced another abrupt vacuum. Windows shuttered, corridors emptied. The cycle repeated: occupation, silence, uncertainty. Stone does not forget. The palace absorbed decades of oscillation, control and collapse, reverence and resentment. Its walls retained the vibrations of arguments whispered behind closed doors. Its staircases remembered hurried descents during moments of crisis. Its courtyard had felt both celebration and abandonment. By the time the Medici returned permanently in 1530, supported by imperial forces under Charles V, Florence itself had transformed into a duchy. The Republic was effectively over. The Medici transitioned from bankers to hereditary rulers. Yet the palace, though still imposing, carried the weight of everything it had endured. It was no longer simply a residence, it was a witness. When the Medici returned for the final time in 1530, the palace no longer functioned as the heart of a banking empire. That era had ended. What remained was something heavier: consolidated rule. Florence had fallen under ducal authority, and Alessandro de' Medici became its first duke in 1532. The palace that once orchestrated loans and papal transfers now housed the machinery of dynastic control. The atmosphere inside had thickened with authority. Guards stood more rigidly along corridors. Meetings were no longer veiled in republican subtlety. They reflected formal governance. The courtyard, still geometrically serene, masked an undercurrent of unease. The transition from influential family to ruling dynasty carried internal fractures. Alessandro ruled from within these walls, but his position was contested. Whispers traveled through chambers late at night. Alliances shifted in candlelit rooms where heavy draperies absorbed sound. The palace, built to project stability, now held the tremor of internal betrayal. On the night of January 6, 1537, those tremors crystallized. Alessandro was lured into a private chamber within Florence by his cousin Lorenzino de' Medici. The assassination itself did not occur in the palace, but its consequence rushed back through its gates like cold air through an open door. News arrived swiftly. The Duke was dead. Inside the palace, the reaction was immediate and controlled. Shock moved silently across faces trained to conceal emotion. The building had witnessed exile and collapse before. Now, it absorbed the reality of internal bloodshed, Medici against Medici. The corridors felt narrower. Servants moved in hushed urgency. The stone walls, unchanged in form, seemed to press inward. Another turning point had been forged in proximity to this place. The palace did not merely house power, it attracted its most dangerous consequences. Cosimo de' Medici soon emerged as successor. Under his rule, Florence evolved further into a centralized state. Yet Cosimo chose to relocate his primary residence to the Palazzo Vecchio and later to the Palazzo Pitti. The original Medici palace began to lose its centrality. It remained significant, but it was no longer the operational core of the dynasty. The psychological shift was subtle but profound. The building that once governed European finance, that had survived conspiracies and revolutions, began to drift into the background of Medici power. Its stones remained immovable, but the epicenter had moved. In 1659, long after the age of Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo the Magnificent, the palace was sold to the Riccardi family. Ownership changed, but the structure endured. Renovations expanded its grandeur. Baroque embellishments layered over Renaissance restraint. Yet beneath architectural modifications, the foundation remained Medici. The palace had evolved from fortress bank to ducal residence to aristocratic property. But its identity was permanently etched by the decades when it functioned as the financial nerve center of Europe. Centuries passed, but the palace continued to stand in Florence, its facade unchanged in essence. Tourists now cross the same threshold where bankers once calculated the fate of kingdoms. The courtyard still channels light downward in controlled symmetry. The chapel frescoes remain luminous, their colors resisting time. Yet the building carries a density that cannot be photographed. The hidden truth inside the Medici castle was never simply about gold reserves or international branches. It was about transformation. Within these walls, finance became governance. Governance became dynasty. Dynasty invited violence. Violence reshaped identity. The Medici Bank, at its height, did not merely facilitate commerce. It constructed a network of obligation that extended across Europe. Kings depended on liquidity provided from accounts balanced inside these rooms. The papacy relied on transfers coordinated beneath these ceilings. Art and architecture that defined the Renaissance were funded by calculations performed here. But the same concentration of influence that elevated the Medici also destabilized them. The palace became a magnet for resentment. Conspiracies were born in response to its power. Exiles were endured because of its influence. Blood was spilled in its shadow. Psychologically, the building reflects compression. Its exterior suggests impenetrability. Its interior reveals complexity. The narrow staircases, the controlled courtyards, the thick doors. Each architectural choice mirrored a philosophy of containment. Information was contained, wealth was contained, authority was contained. Even today, standing within the courtyard, the air feels insulated from the city beyond. Sound reverberates differently. Light filters through with deliberate restraint. The palace was designed not for spectacle, but for endurance. The Medici name eventually faded from sovereign rule. The last Medici ruler, Giangastone de' Medici, died in 1737, ending the main dynastic line. But the palace outlived them all. Its stones have not forgotten. They remember Cosimo calculating risk by candlelight. They remember Lorenzo wounded but resolute. They remember ledgers that carried the weight of Europe. They remember exile, return, betrayal, and reinvention. The bank that ruled Europe no longer exists. The dynasty that mastered credit no longer governs, but the structure that incubated their ascent remains. The hidden truth is not buried in secret tunnels or lost treasure. It is embedded in architecture and consequence. Inside this palace, finance became power, and power demanded sacrifice. The building endures as silent testimony to an era when wealth could crown popes, finance wars, and destabilize republics, all from within a stone courtyard in Florence.